We have a lot of ground to cover today, so we're going to get started here. We're probably going to go the full hour, including questions. So I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar for hospitals and providers on managing cyber risks and the multi-front battle that entails. Our speakers today are Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI, and Frank Yaco, CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives for ASMGI. So without further delay, take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks all of you for attending today and sharing your time with us today. I really appreciate it. And you know what a relevant topic we have to talk about. And I know that cyber insurance or cyber activities are important to the healthcare industry and potentially even number one on the list of strategic initiatives. So I think it's a timely topic as well. So I'll just jump right in and get started. I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI, as Paul said, and joining me today is Frank Yaco. Thanks for being with us today, Frank.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to the conversation, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So here's what we're going to talk about. So introductions we've already done. We'll talk a little bit about the session overview, a little bit about organizational risk in general, and just kind of lay some groundwork for that perspective. We'll mention cyber insurance, which is critically important to managing risk for sure, and the current risks in healthcare. And then we'll propose a risk management model that has been effective for us and other healthcare providers as well. And then we'll open it up for questions. So with that, having said that, we'll get started. But I'd like everybody here to think about like what brought you to the webinar today, right? Is there a specific challenge that you're faced with? Are you attempting to acquire or renew a cyber insurance policy and having challenges from that perspective, or dealing with third-party risk management? Or, you know, what exactly brought you to the webinar today? And we really want to address your concerns. So please leverage the ability to ask questions through the Q&A box and those type of things. And we'll make sure that we tailor the presentation specifically to what you bring up. But think about what brought you here, and some objectives and key takeaways from the webinar today. We'll make sure that we answer these questions. First of all, can you assess and manage organizational risk? It's a great question, and that is something that that we're all challenged with every day, and it's certainly something that we think about as far as our organization goes. Cyber insurance is only one treatment of risks, so we'll address what the other treatments are and how they apply, and then we'll talk about some of what the current cyber risks that we see in healthcare are today, and we'll talk about this risk management overview, or this model of risk management that can be effective at dealing with these things. So fair enough. Let's jump in and get started. You ready, Frank?
Yep, let's go.
Okay, so organizational risk. Can you assess and manage your organizational risk? I mean, it's a great question. What do you think, Frank?
It's a challenge. There's, and we'll get into more detail on it, but there's so many things that just keep surfacing every day that I think really the whole essence of this discussion is just to make sure you have that full peripheral vision and understand all the different aspects that need to be taken into account. But it is a pretty daunting task.
Yeah. So let's start with what is organizational risk, and like how do you define it, and where does it show up in your organization?
Yeah, and from a business perspective, again, these are pretty common now, especially for a number of reasons. From a supply chain perspective, every day here, those things that are constraining businesses from either conducting business or growing, that's a factor, due to a combination of COVID, as well as just some of the inherent things that have been happening in the world. Financial loss, again, that's can be a combination of things that either could be caused by supply chain risk or other aspects, which we'll get into, with certainly things like cybersecurity as well. And then brand or reputation impact as far as the risk or risk goes, that is critical, because the potential impact of rebuilding a brand reputation based on assuming some type of risk and not remediating or mitigating that can be significant. And then from a technology perspective, there's certainly things that are internal use of technology that today pose a risk if those aren't being properly managed. Then also today, many organizations rely on external technology or solutions to conduct business. And then, certainly a part of that is any integration with external entities as well, which can also tie back into the supply chain component as well. And then, the other piece is the service provider. So, it's almost impossible with some of the resource constraints that exist today and specific expertise to have all the resources internal. And a lot of organizations are highly relying on service providers. So that's, again, something that you have to aggressively manage that as well. And then the threat piece is, again, external, internal. Those are things that, unfortunately, every day you hear about internal threat actors that exist out there. But then also you have, plenty of external threat actors that for whatever motivation are posing, a challenge to keep at bay for all organizations.
Yeah. And I would add, particularly in healthcare with digital health, that the amount of technology that's being introduced into this industry is just phenomenal. And so,
right.
The risk, first of all, it's impossible to have any business without risk. There's a business doesn't exist without risk. And so we've all heard the mantra risk reward, the higher the risk, the higher the reward, and those kind of things. I think that's fundamentally true of organizational risk, and it's impossible to have an organization that does not have risk, right? So you can't avoid everything, or you're not doing business, right? So, but in healthcare specifically, with the advent of digital healthcare and healthcare at home and the aging population and all these things, they just kind of add together to really cumulatively increase the amount of risk that the healthcare organization has to deal with. And it's no small feat, that's for sure. So there are forces that influence this risk, both from an external standpoint and from an internal standpoint. Do you want to talk about that, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, that's another area where, to say from an external component, the regulations and compliance requirements, just as an example, because of all the things that we talked about on the previous slide, it's getting to a point where, organizations in some cases are not taking those on and dealing with those themselves. So there's the regulations and compliance requirements that are being mandated for entities to then, focus on those risks. And that, again, that's not something you want to have a way of being motivated, but those are real reality and factors that are out there. So then the other piece, as far as business commitments and contractual commitments, again, everyone lives within an ecosystem. Everyone has clients, customers, or part of that upstream and downstream supply chain, and there's all types of commitments that organizations are being asked to comply with as well. That certainly help to weigh how you prioritize the risk, but also in some cases force you to do things that you might not necessarily be prepared to deal with, and potentially expediting that as well. And then on the internal side, again, there's things that, especially like take the example of the business or growth plans. There's things as organizations grow through acquisition. There might be some risk that organizations have to assume that because of an acquisition and the need to integrate those, that can introduce some potential risks if you're not properly managing that. And then also, as say an organization looks to expand geographically or into another business area, those are things as well that you have to assess the risk associated with all those drivers that ultimately become a risk reward component, as you mentioned.
Right. And I would add, like, compliance. We're going to talk about a few specific things as it relates to compliance. HIPAA is obviously applies to healthcare, but as a business associate, we recognize that as the HIPAA laws change, which there's a fundamental change that conventional wisdom says is going to happen this year. We'll see. But that said, as a business associate, our risk is going to go up. if they add additional compliance requirements or regulatory requirements, but that's true of anything that comes down the pike. So I think what's important to understand is that the threat landscape is changing constantly, and the regulatory requirements, both external and internal forces that influence, risk management, they're changing constantly, and it's not a static, it's a dynamic environment and those kind of things. So who owns organizational risk, Frank?
Well, a lot of times, if anyone thinks about it in terms of cybersecurity, a lot of times it's just assumed that becomes a security issue, or so cybersecurity might own that. But the reality, especially if you take into account all those different factors that we've just been describing, it truly is a business issue or problem. There's not one functional area of a business that, in this case, a lot of times security can handle that. There's all types of decisions and cross-functional inputs that need to be taken into account, and that just requires the overall organization to acknowledge that.
Yep. And we're going to focus today a lot on cyber risk, but that is only one element of organizational risk, and it's important to understand that. But I think the business really has to work together to solve these challenges. It can't all be thrown at the security group to deal with, right? So
even cybersecurity from that standpoint. Even
cybersecurity, quite honestly. So the risk equation, and every risk professional knows this equation, but it's relatively simple math, but it's a complex model, or it can be a complex model. So how would you explain this, Frank?
Excuse me. So there's, again, different ways to look at it. So there's the one piece is the likelihood. So we talked about all those different factors that can have an impact, and if you take that into account and have that peripheral vision again, and awareness, then you have to be in a position to assess what the likelihood of one of those elements affecting your organization, and then coinciding with that is then what impact that could have if that was not remediated, or you're not taking action to reduce it. So the first component is just to understand all those different factors, and that also ties back into the multi-front battle. There's so many different factors that you have to understand, and then in turn be able to prioritize those so you have the ability to decide how to address those and what the potential impact could be to your organization. And then ultimately, by taking both components of that, it can translate into reducing your risk, but you have to be able to tie the two together. They can't just be dealt with in a vacuum or individually.
Yep. And the point I always make is the math, right? It just makes sense. But if you have a really big likelihood and impact still exists, right? So there is some impact to the business, you still have a risk, and maybe even a large risk. And if you have a really big impact, even if the likelihood is low, you still have a risk and potentially a large risk to deal with. So, but if you reduce either one of likelihood or impact, then theoretically your risk will go down, but you would have to reduce it more than you increase the other one. But in any event, it's pretty straightforward math, right? So, and it's multiplicative, right? So if you drive likelihood or impact to zero, then your risk is going to be zero. There is no risk. So I think it suffices from that standpoint. And from a treatment of risk, so there are four ways really to treat risk. You either accept it, and that means if the cost to mitigate a risk is more than the cost of the risk itself, then just accept it. That's what I always say, right? So there's or you avoid the risk, right? And that means you don't take on the risk. And there are multiple mechanisms to do that, but you can't do it 100% of the time, right? You can't avoid every risk, but the metaphor we always use is if the risk is falling off a cliff, don't go near a cliff, and that risk doesn't exist, right? So you can avoid risk, just don't take the risk on. Transferring risk generally means transferring to cyber insurance or carrying it on your balance sheet or some other means of financially, protecting your business against that risk. You transfer and you make somebody else take the risk, right? So, and reducing it is mitigating the risk, and that requires an investment in those kind of things. And I think it's important to really understand that those are the treatments of risk. So you got to pick a bucket to put each risk in, each risk that you identify. And as we talk about the risk model, that'll become more clear. So some food for thought. You want to go through these?
Sure. So again, just talking about the first one, the risk profile, that also again gets into understanding who you do business with, and then the other one, which I just thought of as you were speaking when we were talking about those 4 components or ways to treat it. You can also transfer a risk to a third party that you do business with, if you really think about it, by having them remediate that or deal with that versus you assuming that risk and then just trying to figure out how to deal with it downstream. So that's just something else just to add to that. The other one is how do you plan to deal with that? So again, we talk about the cyber risks across technology applications and end users. That's another one that again, you have to think about it. If you just deal with 1 or 2 of those items and don't deal with the third, then you're just as potentially as exposed as not dealing with them at all. So the whole point is that you have to have that cross-functional view of understanding what the profile is, and we'll get into more detail on what all those different components are. But ultimately, you have to be able to focus on each one of those and have some plan for dealing with those. The other one, we talked about this a little bit as far as the compliance or regulatory requirements. Every industry and vertical, including healthcare, is having more and more of those types of mandates that are coming down. And again, you can't ignore those. You have to keep up with the evolving changes. And there's things that are vertical specific as well as things that are cross or horizontal. And you have to be able to be up on those and make sure that you understand how you have to translate that into the impact on your organization. And then the last one, again, it kind of sounds obvious, but understanding all the different assets that drive your business and also including third-party service providers that you rely on, and making sure that you have that visibility, because the last thing you want to have happen is you encounter some type of issue because there's some component that you just have no visibility to, whether that's shadow IT or something that you manage or own, but you don't really know that it even exists within your ecosystem.
Yep. Great. A lot to think about, for sure. A lot to think about. So let's talk real quick about cyber insurance. And I think, cyber insurance, the industry is really changed a lot over the years and these kind of things. But what's typically included in a cyber coverage and not included, Frank?
So those are evolving, just like everything. There's all types of statistics out there about the impact that organizations have had from even things like ransomware over the past year or two. And so the statistics are staggering when you really look at it, and that's part of the changing dynamic with cyber insurance. You really have to understand what is and is not covered. So from a covered perspective, there's things like notification costs, credit monitoring, civil damages, the forensics, reputational brand and damage. And those are all things that, again, every policy and provider is different, but these are the types of things that you want to make sure are covered in your policy. And that if you don't have those, then ultimately you're accepting the responsibility for performing those types of activities if you had some type of cybersecurity incident. As far as the not covered items, this again is really where it gets critical to understand, either what the things are that are covered or potentially what the limits are on each one of these things. And even with the things that are covered, you should understand what the limits are for your particular policy. And again, there's a lot of detail we could obviously get into on cyber insurance, but the whole point of bringing this up is because if you assume that you're going to transfer the risk as part of a cyber insurance policy and you don't understand what is covered or not covered, then that could be a huge gap in the potential risk that you're assuming as an organization. So that's the reason for listing these things, as far as high level categories. And then, ultimately you have to really dissect what that means for your particular organization.
Yep. And I think it's worth noting, it's a representative list, right? It differs, it truly
Right.
differs for every organization, for every provider of cyber insurance. But I think it's key to understand that it is a moving target, and there is a dynamic associated with it. We did a survey of companies, and they're specific to cyber insurance, right? So we did a survey of companies, and question one was, has your organization ever been provided a security ratings report as part of qualifying for cyber insurance policy? So this is a trend that we see a lot of now in the industry. The cyber insurance providers are all doing, using BitSight or Security Scorecard to run an external view of the risk of an organization to determine whether or not you even receive a policy. And so I think the poll results are very interesting. From this, 45% of the people said, yeah, that's happening. 9% of the people said, no, that's not happening. But 45% of the people said they don't know if it's happening or not, right? So to me, that's a very revealing stat. And what it says is that the people who understand cyber, who are closest to cyber, are probably not the same people that are putting the cyber insurance policies in place. And I think that's a real problem in organizations today. But what do you think about the trends and the way the market is going, Frank?
Well, there's more and more reliance because organizations cannot keep up with remediating risk or reducing the risk that their organization is facing. So a lot of cases they're relying on cyber insurance. So the fact that the cyber insurance companies are relying on reports like this, it's extremely critical that you understand what their view of you is, and then how that impacts not only your policy, but whether you're actually insurable or not. And we refer to it as kind of a hacker's eye view, but the reality is, there's nothing that you can avoid or prevent from those organizations from looking at what your risk profile is. It's out there whether you like it or not.
Yep. And we followed that on with question number 2, which was, has your organization ever been provided a security report from a customer who's checking your cyber security posture, your risk posture? So again, that was pretty revealing. Yes was the predominant answer, right? 70% of the respondents said yes. Only 4% said no. 26% were not sure, right? Is somebody looking at our security posture or not? So that's pretty revealing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely a trend because for anyone that's dealt with third-party risk management in the past, there was the whole method of providing like a questionnaire or assessment that someone, say if your customer or your vendor filled out and then provided that back to you, but there was no way to validate whether that was accurate or not. So the trend is to rely on these types of services or looking at things from that true hacker's eye or external view to really validate whether that organization is representing what their risk profile is. And for better or for worse, a lot of organizations are getting caught that they're not living up to what they say they are actually doing.
Yep. So I want to toggle to the next slide because, whoops, I'm sorry, toggled a little too far. This slide, we actually, so this is healthcare companies, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, but I wanted to make the point, first off, that cyber insurance providers are using these services, and in the spirit of full disclosure, we are a Security Scorecard partner, so we have visibility into these reports as well. But cyber insurance companies are using these reports, and A, B, and C's, they get an insurance policy. D's and F's, they don't get an insurance policy, right? So what maybe you can just reflect a little bit on the results of this, Frank.
Sure. So if anyone's dealt with these types of reports before, there's different ways that the score is broken down. And in the case of Security Scorecard, they use the A, B, C, D, F type of model. And then you could see of the 50 organizations that we analyzed, Basically, you could see the distribution between, each of those grades as far as the overall score. And then, the other point that is really telling, going back to the prior slide of being, assessed or monitored, is there's you don't know who is tracking your organization, but basically security scorecard surfaces for any particular organization the number of actual entities that are monitoring your security score and your risk profile, and are actually alerted when that changes, and something might potentially put that they as an organization at risk. So as part of that whole supply chain view of things. So you could see just the totals across 50 or entities, how many are being tracked, so that if there was any change in any combination of the things that are listed to the right, they basically are notified that that could be a potential risk for them as an organization. So it's really something, again, you could, there's a ton of detail under each one of these categories, but it really comes down to, this is visible to the outside world. It basically is a monitor or barometer of how you as an organization are or not doing relative to each of these categories.
Yeah.
And it's something that, it's just something, again, the reality is that it's fully visible to the whole world. And it's just a matter of whether, you're performing the things that you need to do to keep yourself in good standing from whoever you do business with, or in the case of insurance, potentially even are insurable or not.
Yep. So I just want to highlight a couple things that are apparent. There are 10 categories. This is it's an actual security scorecard result of 50 healthcare companies. And there are 10 categories that security scorecard evaluates companies in, and they get an A, B, C, D, or F grade. It's something we're all familiar with. And the numbers represent how many of each letter for each category. But the number of followers, these are the companies that are generating these reports on whoever's in the survey or in the sample set, right? So there's a lot of people. If they got an A grade, there are 422 people following them. That's phenomenal. The total is 1,173 people following them. But the other point I want to make, Frank, which I think is important to understand, is that we call it the attacker's eye view, right? Because the attackers are using these tools also. It's not just cybersecurity and customers that are using it, right? The attackers are. And if they see a vulnerability that they've bought an exploit kit, or that they know how to exploit, or various different things, they're going to attack you. They're likely to exploit that vulnerability. So if we look at risk equals the likelihood times the impact, likelihood goes way, way up in that case, because the attackers are running these external views of your organization and really, really seeing where you're at. So I think there's a lot of value in this perspective, and just being aware of how the rest of the world sees you from the outside, right? And I think there's a lot of value. So anyway, having said that, I want to highlight this offer. So for any attendees on the webinar today, if you just put your email address, or we can follow up with you or whatever, but send an email or put in the Q&A box that you would like to generate one of these reports, we're happy to send you one, no cost. So we'll send you a report, and we'll either schedule a time to go through it with you and make sure that it's really understandable. So I think that's important to understand. So, well, I want to talk a little bit about current risks in healthcare, and just this whole concept of attack surface and attack vector. We use the attack vector in some of the risk model that we're proposing, but I want to talk about attack surface because I see this a lot and specifically in healthcare. Like there are roles, or there are positions that are responsible for reducing the attack surface. And so what the difference between attack surface and attack vector really is, and I think it's important to understand that. But the term attack surface is often confused with attack vector, but it means something completely different, right? The attack surface is the surface area that's attackable, right? So it's what's being attacked. The vector is how, right? So the attack surface is the what, the attack vector is the how. And I think it's important to make that distinction. And I see in particularly in healthcare, attack surface reduction has really moved up the value chain, and organizations now are trying to reduce the attack surface, right? And so if you think about it, it makes great sense, right? So if you want to prevent an attack, just reduce the attack surface. That's the best way. So we're going to talk a little bit about, from a risk model standpoint, also reducing the attack vector profile by putting specific controls in place and mitigating those risks. But so I thought it would be worthwhile to promote some tips of how to reduce the attack surface and those kind of things. So the one thing that you mentioned already, and that's identifying the physical and the digital assets, right? So discovery is critically important, right? And I just, most or many, I should say, companies don't know what's attached to their network today. And healthcare is no exception to that. There is so much going on in healthcare with digital health and OT and all these things. A lot of things are being connected to the network. Just identifying those is step number one, right? So if you don't know about it, you can't protect it. Review asset management policies, eliminate complexity. This is a huge thing, Frank. Just taking the complexity out of cybersecurity, right? So I think it was Einstein that said, make it, simple enough, but no simpler, right? And I think that's a key important, but one of the ways that you can reduce complexity is just getting rid of the unused stuff, right? So we see this in data governance and data management all the time, right? They call it ROT, there's an acronym for it as well, but prioritizing and strengthening most vulnerable attack points. So again, this is about prioritizing vulnerabilities and really focusing on those that are exploitable and less those where vulnerability may show up from a scanner, but if it's not reachable from the outside or those kind of things, it's probably not exploitable and those kind of things. Conduct an attack surface analysis and continually seek ways to make the attack surfaces smaller. Micro segmentation, I want to mention a couple of things that I think are pervasive in this reducing the attack surface world. So zero trust, clearly, right? And segmenting the network into micro units or whatever. Micro segmentation or nano segmentation is also a term that's commonly used, but being able to break things into micro or nano size bytes, right? Smaller bytes lessens the complexity and those kind of things, and it reduces the attack surface in a lot of cases. Any thoughts on that, Frank?
Yeah, just on that last point, I mean, that there's some devices or technology out there that might be less secure than you'd like them to be. So if you're going through and doing things like that, microsegmentation allows you to compartmentalize or reduce the risk that might have to the rest of your environment. So that's really an excellent option, depending on the profile of the technology.
Yep. I think it's important to make the distinction between the digital ecosystem and the physical ecosystem, right? So digital attack surfaces and physical attack surfaces, and the concept of reducing or attack surface reduction really differentiates between the two of those. And the digital attack surface can be, it's a lot of times it's applications, right? But it's a critical part to transformation, and it is literally the digital aspect. The physical attack surface are the physical assets that make up your organization, and the digital are the digital assets, right? So if you think about it that way, websites and applications and those kind of things are digital assets. And a lot of the things that we leverage and utilize from a productivity standpoint to help us increase the amount of business or operational efficiencies or the amount of business that we can do fall into this categories, and then some controls that you can use to reduce this attack surface. Network segmentation is one of them, security installation, endpoint monitoring, encryption, in any event, I just wanted to mention that shadow IT falls into this this case as well. Physical attack surfaces generally the endpoints, right? So these are the workstations, these are the hard drives, these are smartphones, these are tablets, these are USB drives, and devices. The device level thing are really part of the physical world. So how do you increase security for them? You make them not reachable from the outside world, right? Except for a select few, right? By access controls and those kind of things, policies and user authentication, multi-factor authentication, identity and access management, and those kind of things. Any thoughts, Frank, on digital versus physical?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a buzzword, but the whole concept of digital transformation. I mean, there's just more and more things that are being introduced as part of that whole push to transform organizations, and that's where just having the visibility to what those items are and then determining how to best secure them is really is critically important.
Right. And I think we're seeing more digital today than assets, right? So this move to the cloud, a lot of times it's lift and shift to start with, but then leverage more software defined. We're seeing SD-WAN applications and these kind of things that are generally software defined, right? And so, moving to cloud environments and using platform as a service and those kind of things fits into the digital ecosystem and is part of the digital transformation, right? But it's not a physical asset. So,
right. And the problem with physical assets is that sometimes they have a high or long longevity. I know that's not the right way to say it, but especially in healthcare, where you might have an asset for an extended period of time, and whether the vendor has a provider of that technology is kept up with the security, patching and remediation of that. But the bottom line is those assets hang around for quite a while, and that's where something like the micro-segmentation comes into play to reduce the risk that you might have, and the attack surface is part of that.
Yep. So, the next thing I want to talk about is attack surface discovery. So this is basically, what does it mean to discover everything that could be an attack surface for your enterprise? And, I think it's important to understand that new attack surfaces come out all the time, right? As we evolve in this digital transformation, in this technology landscape, we see attack surfaces evolve, but it's not just attack surfaces, also attack vectors. So first the attack surface comes out, a new device, IoT devices, for example. There already been cases of exploitations of vulnerabilities found on IoT devices and those kind of things. And the bad guys are going to exploit them eventually, right? And so then it becomes an attack vector. But first it's an attack surface, right? And so, as we grow our digital ecosystem, certainly our attack surface is going to grow. And I think it's important, to your earlier point, that you discover everything that's part of that ecosystem, everything that's, I've heard it said different ways, like everything that's on your network and those kind of things. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it's so critically important to understand. In healthcare, it's everywhere, right? And it's everything. And so OT, we generally think of operational technology as it relates to manufacturing or, continuous monitoring like petrochemical and those kind of things. But healthcare has a lot of OT, right? And so even the devices, that are historically, considered medical devices and those kind of things, they're really just OT. They have firmware installed on them and nothing else. But when you think about the amount of OT that's within a healthcare organization, a provider or a hospital network or system, it's huge, right? If you just kind of go through what this looks like, all the medical devices are OT devices. And then you just go out a layer, and there are all these industrial control systems at hospitals as well. Redundant power, redundant, water, everything has to be redundant and has to be controlled by something, right? And so there are all these things, refrigeration and HVAC and power and water and fire suppression, building automation, they all apply to hospitals, right? So we don't often think of those things, but they are an attack surface, and they can influence behaviors within that hospital. The Internet of Things it's happening, right? It's very real and pervasive. We see, Internet of Things popping up all over the place. So connecting all kinds of devices to the internet, and they all become an attack surface, right? But in a hospital setting, it's everything from the smart TV in the rooms, to the beds that move, and physical security, digital assistance, all of these things, inventory tracking. I've seen hospitals who have robots in their basements that bring inventory to the floors, right? It's incredible the amount of IoT that's within a hospital network. And so I think it's important to make that point. And I call that out, and we've called it out. We've done some webinars in the past, and I think in December of last year, we did a webinar on this executive order that came out in 2021. It came out May 21st of 2021. And the executive order 14028 has a lot of things in it, but it's the president saying, hey, we need to protect our digital assets. We need to better protect our cybersecurity infrastructure and those kind of things, or our critical infrastructure. Healthcare is critical infrastructure. So we know this is going to get pushed down to healthcare. Initially, it applies to entities who do business with the government. So the VA network of hospitals and things like that are immediately implicated by this executive order. But we know that all hospitals are part of critical infrastructure, and so that it's going to push down. And some of the things that came out of this were zero trust and the software bill of materials, the SBOM. So any comments on that, Frank?
Yeah, if someone's not familiar with this, it's definitely worth understanding, because it not only dictates might be a strong word, but specifies what you as an organization should be doing, but then even more importantly, what a third party should be providing to you as well. And that's really where, you have to be able to look at it from multiple angles. And it's something that I think we're going to be talking about for quite a while, because not only do a lot of the things that are called out in there, some cases don't exist, but are certainly impactful. But it's going to be an evolution as far as adoption of what's required for this.
Yep. So it brings up, that slide brings up a good thing. Like regulatory or compliance issues are pervasive in healthcare as well. And HIPAA is something that we're all familiar with. Anybody who's in healthcare is familiar with, and certainly we are from a BAA standpoint. There are some changes coming down the pike to HIPAA. There haven't been a lot of changes to HIPAA historically, right? So it's a big deal, and this will influence. This is an external factor that will influence the risk associated with HIPAA. There's no question. So I wanted to mention that as well. Let's talk about a risk management model. I think that makes sense in the context of all of these things that we've discussed to date. So risk management equals risk assessment plus incident response. And we have a lot of things to talk about. So I want to take cyber insurance off the table for this discussion. And we'll talk about like how to remediate these risks. We could probably take avoiding the risk off the table as well, but let's talk about how to remediate them and how to deal with the risks. And we'll just take accept and transfer and avoid just right off the table and get to that. So just leveraging that model, that risk management model, a risk management equals a risk assessment plus incident response. If you think about it that way, just how would you define the risk assessment, Frank?
So, we've broken it down into these various categories, but the first one is just really defining what your risk profile is. So from a cyber risk perspective, having that full visibility of your organization, understanding, what are the potential risks to your organization, again, very holistically. And then, again, looking at it as far as actually defining that relative to that outside in view, that hacker's eye view that we reference. But also inside, because there's some things that, whether it's like we've talked about, or the integrations that you have from within your organization to critical third parties that you do business with, and then the inside component, which we haven't talked a lot about, but the whole idea of insider threat, that's another one that you hear so much about, that is something that's critical. So, if you're not looking at things from each of those components as far as truly understanding what your risk profile is, then it goes back to the whole concept of you can't address or manage what you don't know about or have a perspective on. So that really is from the cyber risk overall perspective. Then when you start getting into the actual technologies pieces, it gets down into, already have these risks that you've identified. What are the components potentially from a technology perspective that are associated with that, or support a business function? That's really where the asset inventory comes into play. Having those things so that you're not, surprised that something's been potentially hacked or data has been exfiltrated when you didn't even know the data resided in a certain place, which is certainly an issue. And then, again, dealing with, do you have all the visibility to monitor, what is going on within your environment based on understanding what all the different assets are and having some type of real-time visibility to that. That's something that's different than obviously up-down type of scenarios. And then, based on having all those assets, going through and understanding, what the actual vulnerabilities are that exist with those. And that can be a very broad range of items, especially with all the different attack surfaces that we were talking about during the course of this discussion.
Right.
Don't have a sense of what those vulnerabilities are and which ones have the actual most risk to your organization, then you have no ability to prioritize those. You could be doing a lot of different things, but if it's not the most impactful components, then you're not really helping reduce your risk.
And I think that's a key point, Frank, that really heightens the effectiveness of a vulnerability management program is prioritizing those vulnerabilities, right? And dealing with the high risk, not just the high CVE scores, but the things that are exploitable first. Like, so you may have an outdated operating system or those kind of things, but if the system's not reachable, then it's not exploitable, right? So you still have to fix it. It still shows up on a vulnerability management report, but it's less of a priority than fixing things like Log4j, right? That's being exploited in the wild. There are people that are actually doing bad things based on that. And so they're looking for it, right? They're running scanners and they're looking for those kind of things. And, this all ties back to that external vulnerability scan from Security Scorecard. The bad guys are using this, right? That's why we call it the attacker's eye view. They're using it. So I'm just going to move through some of these things pretty quickly. The same thing from an application standpoint. We really, we have mechanisms for identifying vulnerabilities in software applications and componentizing that and prioritizing that, right? But I think that's critical important. But the thing to understand about applications is identifying vulnerabilities in the code base, right? So the components of the code, you do that through through SEA scanning and doing static analysis testing and these kind of things. So you're running scans on the code itself, but you're also doing dynamic analysis testing and scanning the application after it's been compiled or is running in an environment and those kind of things. So it's important to really understand that. And again, just doing MDR or monitoring, detection, and response on that, and flushing out those vulnerabilities and prioritizing them and actually remediating the ones that are exploitable. The end user threats, just basically making sure everybody in your organization really understands the importance of cybersecurity and risk management. That's a critical component. But I think the risk-based thinking is something that really resonates with me personally, and that's a way of thinking that I think that everybody needs to really get on board with. It's not about basically having a clean vulnerability scan so much as it is really understanding what the risk of a vulnerability is. And if the risk doesn't exist, then you don't have to worry about it, right? It isn't that you don't have to worry about it. You truly don't have to worry about it, but you don't worry about it, right? Just worry about the ones that have risk, and trust me, there are plenty that do. But from an end user standpoint, doing awareness training and those kind of things. I want to talk a little bit about some of this attack vector analysis, because I think this is critically important. And just, why don't you just walk us through here, Frank, where we don't have a lot of time left. It's 1:50, we have 10 minutes left, but if you can just kind of take us through what it looks like to analyze the attack vectors.
Yeah, so this is obviously is a very complex process, but the goal is to take those concepts that we've talked about and apply them in some type of actionable form. And so going through and again understanding what all the different things are that your organization does as part of business, and what the associated risk profile of that is. I mean, if you do business in the United States only, or a certain state, versus externally, are you open, what you have open to the rest of the world versus internal. I mean, there's all those moving parts that you have to understand, and then that translates into identifying of your risk profile, what are those attack vectors, and that again gets into the things that we were just talking about of really documenting those things. Then the correlation of that to your business impact, that's really where you understand what the potential risk to the organization is for those particular items, and then how that could affect either a part or all of your organization. And again, that's this your basically your business impact and continuity type of assessment. Once you understand that, is really then that's where you have to engage the rest of the business to make sure that you have a holistic perspective of what they rely on to drive the business, and then what in turn you have to be able to prioritize as far as the various components that support the business. Once you go through that, making sure that you have an appropriate incident response type of plan to deal with the potential impacts that might occur, and how do you deal with those. These are not things you want to define in the heat of the battle. So going through and having that mapped out as part of a plan like this is critically important. And then prioritizing those those various components, and then deciding where you want to do and don't want to remediate those as well as part of this type of analysis. And then again, the whole process of going through and documenting for those potential risks, how you would deal with those, and then ultimately resulting into some type of exercises like tabletops, and even more detailed testing to make sure that you're prepared, especially based on the things that are high likelihood and have a high risk to the organization.
Yep. And we're going to talk about incident response some, so we'll go through that tabletop exercise. But I wanted to really bring this up because there are different activities that you can do for each of these categories that are important. And do you want to take us through a couple of these, not through the whole table?
Sure. So the thing that hopefully is coming out through this discussion is that there's a recurring theme here. One is you want to have an inventory and understand what is in your organization, and that's for all the areas that are across the columns: third-party technology application and end users. Then going through that risk profile process, and again, the actual how might vary, but it's the same concept across each of those different disciplines, including for end users. And that's where even for end users, you want to go through and do assess what the current state is of the familiarity, even with like some of the basic concepts of cyber hygiene or appropriate use. I mean, all the basics, but those are the things that are sometimes overlooked. Then you want to have some type of monitoring for each of those various disciplines as well. And again, the how might vary, but it's something that is critically important, because again, these are things that change quickly, and if you don't have the mechanisms in place to actively monitor each of those different components, then that's something that you have that could induce risk in your organization. Then the vulnerability management or remediation, again, same thing. There's different treatments of how you deal with those, but the same concept. If you're not taking things through this full life cycle, and pretty much on a continual basis, that's why we talk about this in a multi-front battle. There's a lot of different things that could happen, but if you have the sort of the muscle memory for doing these these things in the left column on a consistent basis across this breadth of items or areas, it'll significantly reduce your risk profile as an organization.
I think a couple key points, Frank, are it applies to everything, right? So
Right.
no matter how you categorize things or what the categories are, you have to do these activities for each category. And what I wanted to say one thing about monitoring too. So there is a trend in the industry going on, and that's a movement away from the point in time, like pen test or,
Right.
We assess a lot of times third parties once per year. Right. So
This could change
monitoring is
instantly.
moving towards a continuous model. And that's what a lot of the tools that are modern technology tools are really vested in finding out if anything changes, like right now, real time, right? It's immediate and it's continuous. So I think that's a key element of the monitoring, is a continuous monitoring standpoint. I want to go through incident response some, but I want to focus on this because we leverage NIST 861, to create as a framework to create an incident response plan. We do this for customers regularly and those kind of things. But Frank, can you just kind of go through the pre-incident, the during the incident, the post-incident aspects of this?
Sure. So this ties back to everything that we're talking about on the prior slides as well, is that, the whole idea is to not, just react, even if you have the ability to react to an incident and have that all buttoned up, you have to look at it from each stages: the pre-incident, during the incident, post-incident, and the things that you should be doing to, again, the model is broken out by the second level of preparation, detection, analysis, containment, eradication, discovery, or recovery, and post-incident. The whole idea is to take these, steps and make sure for all the things that you've understood are basically the attack surface and the risks to your organization, and make sure that you have some ability to deal with those in the context of a model like this. And it doesn't, you could again, be great at executing in the heat of the battle, but there's all those upstream things that need to take place and are part of the whole concept of like the tabletops, and even exercising those skills so that you can reduce the impact of something when it occurs, versus just trying to create it on the fly, and that just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think conventional wisdom is it's not if but when, right? So we know incidents are going to happen. It is unfortunate, but it's reality, right? So incidents are going to happen, and during an incident is not the time to figure out who you're going to call or what you're going to do next, or those kind of things. So plan for it. We say at ASMBI, practice, right? You can't do that enough. So we talk a little bit about how to implement an incident response plan. I want to just kind of move through this a little bit, but playbooks are critically important. So a part of the incident response plan is doing tabletop exercises. And this is where you have an opportunity and you bring team members together and you actually have an opportunity to plan. But these are some of the things that could be incidents, the attack vectors, right? Quite honestly, this is the how you're attacked. And why don't you just talk about how to, create playbooks for each one of these real quick?
So I know we have just a few more minutes. So the whole idea is, if you understand from the left column what might impact your organization, then you can go and follow those steps for that we outlined on the prior slides for those specific type of potential risks to the organization. So having doing that analysis, and then taking and applying the steps that we outlined on that prior couple of slides is really what you ultimately want to be able to do. And the one important point to remember is that this is, like we stressed, this is not just for your organization. This could also include your critical service providers, and they have to be part of that process as well. So, even from a contractual perspective, you have to be able to hold them accountable to be able to execute against a model like this. And that's where the value of rallying around the 861 model is. That creates a common language that you can also communicate effectively when you have to deal with these types of scenarios as well.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. So I think that's a key point, is just being able to rally around something, right? So
Right.
an 861 does a really good job. So we have a couple of questions I want to get to. I have a couple of announcements to make, and I know we're out of time, so I'm going to try to go really quick. How can cyber risks be addressed during and after an M&A event? So we see in healthcare, there's a lot of consolidation going on. So what would you say to that, Frank?
So the first thing is to go through some type of due diligence process. So, it could be as simple as doing a security, risk profile through like a entity or service like security scorecard to do that hacker's eye view of the target acquisition to understand what their risk profile looks like. And then there's the next level of detail that you get into, as far as the full due diligence process. But that's extremely important because you're going to potentially have some significant investment depending on what the results of that are, and you should understand what you're going to take on as an organization as part of that process.
Yep. Cool. Given financial situations that many hospitals are currently working through, is it possible to have a phased-in approach to cyber risks? So is it possible to phase this stuff, or do you have to do it all at once, or how do you really accomplish this?
Yeah, I think that if I know, we're going through this material, but for anyone that's attended today, if you go through the things that we've outlined, that really is the goal. There's no way you can go and solve and deal with all these things, all at once. You have to be able to prioritize them, understand what the potential impact is to your organization, and then deal with those appropriately, and and prioritizing those so that you can determine, in some cases, what investments might be required and what you can actually fund as an organization. So the goal is to break it down so that you can actually get some actionable results out of the process.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. As a hospital administrator, last question. I have a large group of employees that think they're always the most sophisticated at everything they do and above the need for training that the rest of our employees must go through. How do I get my doctors more engaged in cybersecurity awareness training?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, one of the options is to actually, either do some type of assessment, which, you can do against your employees or the doctors to have them complete, some combination of questions. The other is a little bit more aggressive, and that's to do the phishing campaigns and find out, who is actually most vulnerable or susceptible to, unfortunately clicking on a link or falling for some type of phishing scam, and then they can become the target for any type of remedial training and follow up, and give you the ammunition that you need to address that risk.
Yeah, cool. And I would say that one mechanism, I had and it was actually a customer who told me this. He said, people hate being on a list, a bad list. So just publish like who is taking training and who hasn't. I think that's one way to get people just to influence behaviors, right? To get them to, but make it a compliance requirement. I guess that's the gist of it. So I want to go through a couple of these things and announcements. The special offer I already announced, but we're definitely willing to provide a report, an outside-in report that the attackers, your customers, and your cyber insurance providers are definitely using. So we're definitely willing to do that and set up a time to explain that report. But I also want to talk about coming up in May on the 24th through the 26th. So towards the end of May, we're participating and sponsoring AI Med, which is it's a great program. It's in San Francisco this year, and it's AI is one of those areas. You talk about it increasing attack surface, right? As AI becomes more pervasive in the digital transformation of enterprises, healthcare is no exception to that. And there are a lot of use cases that are really value adding or can be value adding from an AI standpoint. It's software, right? So it's data and it's software. So these are all things that you don't want to get out, patient information and those kind of things, PHI. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity at AI Med. And so it's a great program, and I would encourage everybody to register if possible. And you can get 10% off the registration if you use that code from ASMGI. So any closing remarks, Frank?
No, I mean, the biggest thing is like you've asked, earlier, one of the questions about how to go about this. I mean, what we really, we're not just trying to, preach gloom and doom here or anything, with the things that we've included in this webinar and in these slides is really how to attack this problem. It's something that unfortunately is not going to go away. It has to be aggressively dealt with. And it's, but we've provided the method for going and breaking it down so that you can be able to do it in phases, but still understand, the things that would have the most impact to your organization and how to prioritize those. So
Right.
that's really, unfortunately, it is a huge problem. It's an ongoing thing as well, which I know we've stressed as well. But
Yep.
it's something that is critically important to deal with as an organization.
Right. And for my closing remarks, I would emphasize the importance of third-party risk. As we, as organizations, embark on this journey together in this digital transformation journey, we're placing more and more of our data in the hands of third parties. And that's, what I say to third parties all the time is you don't want to be the one that causes a data breach at your provider, right? So, but it's true of all organizations, and certainly healthcare is moving in that direction too. So that's just keep that on the front burner. And the other thing I would emphasize is that, that list of that one table that we showed where you have a list of activities to do, it really applies to every category that you have in your organization. So thank you. I want to thank everybody for attending today. And thanks, Frank, for sharing your wisdom as well. It's clear to me that we really know what we're doing, and that's it's a great program, I think, to really embark and help people along that journey and make sure that you're addressing the most important things. So thanks, everybody. Cheers.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.